Now.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the program on gardening on your deck. My name is Linda Stein. I'm a master gardener in Dakota County. I've also been a gardener, an avid gardener for about 40 years, but last year I made a significant change in my lifestyle. I moved from a single family dwelling to an apartment building. So although I had plants on my deck and I had plants in my overhang in the front before, all of a sudden my deck became my primary gardening source. So it became a particular interest to me to address this topic. So before we begin the presentation, I'm not sure if all of you know what Master Gardening is. The University of Minnesota Extension sponsored us within Minnesota. And as a retired public health official, the thing that really appealed to me is that we promote healthy people, healthy communities, and healthy plants through the education on gardening techniques that are research-based. This is just a diagram that shows the priorities of master gardeners. So we look at how we promote local foods, nearby nature, how we attempt to use gardens to assure the survival of pollinators and other topics related to gardening. So, getting into the topic, why garden on your deck? Certainly for people like me who live in a multifamily setting, the deck is the priority site for me to be able to easily access my garden. But even if you live in a single family dwelling, you may want to have a deck garden because of the beauty it adds to that deck or patio. I'm using the deck term generically. You may want to use the deck for growing plants and herbs so that they're close to your kitchen. Or you may have physical limitations that prevent you from doing in-ground gardening. And the deck would be a source for you to do that gardening. So today we're going to cover choosing the plants and choosing the container, what kind of soil you might want to select, and of course, ongoing care for those plants that you put on your deck. The first consideration, of course, is the location. How much sun are your plants going to receive? And that's directly related to what direction your deck is facing, north, south, east, or west. The one location that gets the most sun is the south-facing deck. And initially you'd say, wow, that's wonderful, you know, I get all day sun. But in reality, that creates a lot of concerns. Primarily is the fact that you have to look at plants that require intensive light and sun. And you have to also be aware that the intensity of the sun causes those plants to dry out more readily. So when you're picking flowers or plants for your south-facing deck, you have to make sure that you're picking plants that really like that intense sun. Plants of choice might be native plants that are very used to our climate. So that's the focus of the south-facing deck. The next deck that has the next most sun would be the west-facing. The wonderful thing about the west-facing deck is that you get the amount of sun that allows you to grow almost any herbs, flowers, or vegetables, but you don't have that intensity of sun that the south-facing deck has. So the only plants that you really have to avoid if you have a west-facing deck are those that are shade-loving. Moving on to the east-facing deck, it also gets 6 to 8 hours of sun generally, but those are usually the sunlight in the morning, which we refer to as tender sunlight. Again, wonderful site for planting a lot of different kinds of plants, almost all herbs, tomatoes, and other vegetables can be planted, and many of the flowers that like sunlight. Even if you have a north-facing deck, you can assume that you can have a wonderful garden. There are a lot of wonderful shade plants that will survive on that site. I list here ferns and grasses, hydrangeas, impatiens. And if you look at these pictures, I always have loved the various coleus that can really brighten up a garden. The only exception, of course, is that you really can't plant any herbs or vegetables. And hope that they'll survive this environment. So even if you've selected the location, there are other impediments that might restrict the light. One consideration is, do you have bricks or concrete or other reflective surfaces that might create what we refer to as heat sinks, causing the plants to dry out more readily, or even reflecting and creating much more light than you assume you have in that location. Obviously, you have to think about structures like trees and overhangs that are going to change the impact of the sun. And finally, you have to really think about, and this is something I don't think we all think about, and that's how the sun's location in the sky might and does change over the course of the year. This diagram kind of illustrates it. In the summer, the sun is high in the sky, so overhangs are, for example, going to be more of a problem. In the autumn and spring, the sun has come lower in the sky, and therefore trees or other structures, buildings or walls that are outside your building might have a more significant effect on the plants. Here's a picture of my deck that's facing east, and it's a beautiful tree that I have right outside. I love it because it provides us with wonderful privacy. It looks beautiful, but it certainly has an impact that I had to consider as I looked at what plants I was going to put on my deck. In addition to looking at the location, there are other considerations as you look at the various plants that might survive in your environment. Size of the plant is one example. The light we talked about, the production habits. And let me talk about what I mean by that. Let's say you want to plant beans. There are so many different types of beans. You could be looking at bush beans or pole beans, and this decision on which of those you select has a significant impact on what kind of space you need to grow those plants. On the right side is a bush bean. They stay low. They require a lot more horizontal space. Their production is over a short period of time, whereas a pole bean, the one pictured in the left, grows upwards. So you don't need as much horizontal space to grow the beans. Another example is tomato plants. On the left is what we refer to as indeterminate plants, and on the right is a determinate. Determinate plants grow to a set height and then stop, whereas indeterminate continue growing. You can see the impact of that as you think about what plant you might want to put in a container on in your deck. So determinate, indeterminate, but even if you look at selecting a determinate plant, for example, there are certain varieties that you might want to consider. I think we're really fortunate now. If you go to any of your nurseries or reputable garden stores, they're going to be able to direct you to the type of tomato that would do well in a garden, and the same with other plants. The other thing to think about is, even if you decide on a certain kind of flower, that there are different varieties of that flower that might do well in various environments. So for example, on the right is the impatiens that we generally think about. That's kind of a plant of choice for shade areas. However, there are now sun patiens that do well in sun, and New Guinea impatiens can do well in sun and partial shade. So just be aware as you look at and select the plants that you're going to be putting in your garden, that they're ones that will fit in your sun or shade environment. Choosing a container. So a container can be anything that holds soil and has drainage holes. So you could be picking out a pot that is intended for a garden use, like this strawberry plant, but you don't necessarily have to go out and buy a pot. Here they've done a nice job of using metal containers to grow tomatoes. Using plastic bins for doing the same purpose. They do very well. But you can also get very creative. I love this. So if you look at the shoes, they have succulents. Succulents don't require a lot of depth, so they do quite well in a shoe like that. And the purse allows them to put plants in it that require more depth for their root system. I'm not sure what my the other people in my building would think if I put this outside my building, but I think it's quite a creative way of using some leftover clothing to use as a source for growing your plants. So, considering and selecting a container, certainly one of the concerns is eye appeal, but you also have to think about the impact on the plants and on its maintenance. The material's porosity, the porousness of the material, the weight of the container, and the size and color all make an impact on your plants. Clay pots are certainly ones that we all consider. They're wonderful for using with your plants. They're heavy, which prevents tipping. They're porous, which means good aeration. So water, you can't overwater real readily because it will leach through the pot. But on the other hand, the soil dries out faster than in some other materials. You have to be concerned about mineral salts and algae that may collect on the exterior. The other concern is that it is breakable. Once they fall, they readily break, and they're much more expensive than plastic. On the other hand, plastic pots are lightweight and they're easy to handle. As I said, they're less expensive. They're easier to clean. Overwatering is a problem, just as we talked about with the clay pots, that it leaches the water out. The plastic pots are going to hold that water in, so that's a concern. Tipping is a concern. They're lightweight, and if you're in an area with a gusty wind, as happened to me this last summer, I went out on my deck and the plants that were in plastic pots were lying on their side after a bad windstorm. The size of the container is also, of course, a major concern. The depth of the container was one of the most important factors, because you want to make sure that your root system has an opportunity to grow and develop. You want to make sure that the soil is providing enough cushion between the roots and the outside environment. They keep it from getting too hot or too cold. I just listed there some of the symptoms that you might look at that might indicate to you that your roots are cramped, that the plant its growth has gone down, the plant is wilting, the leaves are starting to yellow, or some of the new leaves are dropping, or the leaves that are growing are much smaller than you intended. The other thing to think about, of course, is the size of the plant when it's at its maturity. Unless you want to be repotting regularly, instead of putting the plant in a very small pot, think about what that plant is going to be at the end of the summer, so that you're growing it in a pot that will accommodate it. I just listed here, so when you're thinking about the size of the pot, as I indicated when I talked about that shoe, succulents really don't require a deep pot because their roots are very short. But if you're looking at, on the other hand, areas like tomatoes, carrots, or peppers, you're going to need a much deeper pot. In between that are perennials that have small bulbs, or annuals that require a much shorter pot. Color is another consideration. Certainly personal preference addresses that, but it also impacts the plant. And I think about in the summer when I'm sitting outside and I'm wearing blue jeans and my legs get really hot and sometimes even burn because of the heat of the sun. Well, the same holds true if you're talking about your plants. Dark colors are going to absorb heat and cause the soil to warm up, cause it to dry out more readily. So if you're thinking about putting a pot on a south-facing deck, for example, be aware that that hot sun combined with a dark pot is going to have a significant effect on your plants. So on the other hand, you might want to consider having a light colored pot, which is reflecting the heat and will allow the plant to not dry out as readily. Soil selection. Next, we're going to look at soil. If you're planting in a container, You're going to want to use all-purpose potting soil usually. And I want to emphasize that we're talking about potting soil, not gardening soil. Gardening soil is much denser. It's not going to drain as readily. So even though gardening soil might be a little cheaper because you can get the big the big bags, it's not really conducive to containers. You can also find soilless potting medium. Usually that's made of peat. It certainly works well. Just be aware that that medium often needs to be, if it loses its moisture, it tends to be difficult to rehydrate. And it also has nutrients that have been added after the fact, so that after those nutrients have been used, you have to fertilize much more frequently. In addition, you want to think about special potting soil for some types of plants. When you go to, again, your reputable nursery, you're going to see special bags that are addressed for orchids, cacti, palms, bromeliads, and azaleas. And these planting mediums are those that will help the plant feel like it's in its native environment. I don't know, are there any questions? I want to make sure before we go on with the ongoing care.
There's none in the chat, but does anyone want us to ask something or say something?
Okay.
Okay.
Thorough, but I will continue. So ongoing care, I want to look at how you're potting, watering, fertilizing, when you want to deadhead, and what do you do about pests and diseases. Potting. The one important thing to think about is making sure that whatever pot or container you use, there's a hole in the bottom of the pot to allow the plant, the water to drain out. You can get away with putting gravel in the bottom of a container that doesn't have a hole, but the preferred type of pot is that with a hole. You want to cover the hole with something that's going to prevent the soil from draining out. And I listed here examples. You can use coffee filters, paper towels, even gravel will serve that purpose. When you're putting the soil in your pot, you want to just fill it to about 1 inch below the top of the pot itself. So leaving enough space in between the surface of the soil and the top of the pot. The other thing to think about, if you have those great big pots that become really, really heavy, especially if you have a clay pot that you're using for tomatoes or some very large plant, it can become very heavy and very difficult to move around. And it also becomes expensive to fill with the potting soil. You might think about putting things in there that serve as fillers. A great example, a lot of us have these little pill bottles around that you can use to put in, just sticking them in the bottom of the pot, filling the pot with soil. The roots of the plant will work their way around it. You will have less weight from the heavy soil, and it'll be less costly because you won't need as much soil to fill that pot. When you're potting, I really think about not just putting one plant in each pot. The rule of thumb when you're doing it from an aesthetic perspective is to have thrillers in the middle. In this case, they have some tomatoes, putting fillers around those thrillers, and then spillers that move around the pot on the outer edges. The other thing that this example shows in the picture is combining different types of plants. Here you have tomatoes in the middle and you have flowers on the outside, which is a great idea because using the flowers in combination with the vegetables potentially will attract pollinators that would be useful to those tomatoes. So think about combining herbs, vegetables, and flowers as you're looking at combining plants in a particular pot. You also might want to consider vertical gardening. Selecting of vining plants that move up trellises, like we talked about with the bean plant is an example. Selecting shelving or containers at various heights for an aesthetic perspective and also to allow you to have more plants. Hanging pots are a great example. And as in the upper left-hand corner of the picture, try upside down gardening. Instead of having your tomato moving up through a cage, have it hanging down and producing your plants below it. I think it's really a kind of a fun looking alternative. Watering. I can't tell you here's how you're supposed to water, because watering and how much water a plant needs depends on the type of plant, the type of container, as we talked about, the temperature, you know, is it hot and humid, or is it going to be, are you in a dry environment? And the potting medium is going to affect how much water a plant needs. How do you water? Water when the plant needs it, not on your own schedule. What you want to do is feel the soil, stick your finger in to make sure that the soil is drying out about an inch below the surface of the soil. Water thoroughly and let the water drain out through the bottom. After it's drained out, take that saucer and pour the water out so that you're not leaving the poor roots of the plant soaking in water. And be aware of the particular kind of plant you have. Some plants, and this is what you're going to have to look at as you buy those plants, some require and prefer a moist soil, while others much prefer to have the soil dry out between watering. Use water at room temperature, not too cold or too hot, and avoid watering the foliage. Watering the foliage, whether it's in the outside garden or if it's a gardening in a container, can promote disease within the plants. So keeping the foliage dry would be preferred. I think this is interesting. Watering midday can be a way of cooling off your plants. I know when you work in the garden in the ground, you want to water in the early morning. Here, the suggestion is using it at midday to keep the temperature adequate for the plant to grow. Here's just pictures of what a plant might look like if it's too wet or too dry. So on the top, you see overwatering where the leaves have become yellowed. You might see the stems edema, like swelling. You might see some of these little hairy root systems growing out of the stem. And you also might smell the rotting of the roots because of the overwatering. Underwatering, you're going to see this, I think, is much more obvious, the drying around the leaves. Sometimes the leaves are actually brown and dying. You might see the plant becoming very stunted and woody because of the underwatering. So basic question, rule of thumb in watering, if in doubt, don't. We have more problems and more people overwater than underwater, and that has the impact on the plants that I talked about. Fertilizing is the next thing. For container gardens, you'll want to start fertilizing 2 to 6 weeks after you've planted them. You can use all-purpose fertilizers. There are various options. Some are slow release, some are soluble. To promote flowers or fruit production, you want to use a fertilizer that's higher in phosphorus or potassium. When you see the numbers on the side of a fertilizer, you're going to see—
I don't know how to respond to that.
Ooh, excuse me. You have nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are the 3 numbers that you see. Nitrogen is the first number, so if you're promoting flowering and fruiting, you want the second and third number to be higher. And I can attest to that. I had these wonderful— I was growing beans in this example. They were doing beautifully. I fertilized them. I had the most beautiful looking plants, lots of leaves, but absolutely no beans. Realized that the fertilizer I'd used had much more nitrogen and not adequate fertilizer, potassium and phosphorus to promote the fruit growth. Soluble fertilizer is one of the best options. That's fertilizer that you can dissolve in water if you have limited root space. When nutrients are needed real quickly, you see that your plant really, really needs fertilizer. So the soluble will get to that plant more readily. And large, fast-growing plants do better with soluble fertilizer. If you have a plant that dries out fast, if you're in a setting like a southern exposure that dries out quickly, you might want to fertilize more frequently. If you do that, just look at the amount that the fertilizer document suggests. So if they say you're supposed to put 2 tablespoons, for example, per gallon, maybe fertilize more frequently, but use 1 tablespoon instead. So that's another option if you feel that you want to assure that the plant is getting out of adequate fertilizer. Deadheading. What is deadheading? Deadheading is removing all the old spent blooms and the developing seeds. The reason you'd want to do it is you want to prolong the blooming period for annuals. You want to encourage perennials to rebloom once they've had their first blooms die out. Now you can see in many of the nurseries that there are varieties of plants that don't require deadheading, but deadheading won't hurt even those plants. So what you want to do is take the stem just below the spent flower and just pinch it or cut it off. Or if you have flowers that are, these large spiky flowers, you're going to cut or pinch them just above the first leaf. Insects and disease control. The first step to prevent this, of course, is to select plants and look at them very closely when you're purchasing them to make sure they don't have any disease or infestation. If you do see them happening on your plant, you can try to prune out the bug or the disease infested area of the plant. And if that doesn't work and you want to treat the plant, you have to know the specific disease or insect that you're addressing. Again, I can't really talk about that because it could be anything depending on the type of plant or the type of insect or bug that's affecting your plant. So I really encourage you to go to the University of Minnesota's Yard and Garden section. They have a wonderful page that says, what's wrong with my plant? You can look up the type of plant. You can look at pictures that, so you can identify what's happening with your particular plant, and they will advise you on what to do to address that issue. Point of thumb, never apply any chemicals to a moisture distressed plant. So if they're too dry, please don't put any chemicals on them. And we talked about watering the plant and how that might be a problem. Misting a plant also might encourage diseases in your particular plant. So pests. You think if you're way up on a deck that's above the lower level that you might not have pests. But I wanted to show you, this is an example. This is a picture of my parsley plant. It was on the 2nd floor deck of my house. I never could figure out how did these little guys get there. But those are black swallowtail larvae, and they love parsley. And this was I thought they were adorable. My granddaughter just loved them because if you touch them, they point out these little horns at the top. But they certainly didn't like my parsley plant because this is what it looked like the very next day.
Oh.
Just surprising what they did. Now, I guess I feel okay because I sacrificed this to the swallowtail butterfly, which is a wonderful pollinator, but they can do a real job on your plants, and they can do it whether it's on the ground or if you're on a deck above ground. Finally, I wanted to talk about perennials. Perennials certainly can be used on deck, but you have to address them in a very different way than you might if they're in the ground and you want them to survive for the next season. Why is that the case? Well, if the perennial is in a pot, the soil is going to dry out much more readily than it would in the garden. The air is colder above ground. If you have plants in the ground, the soil is protecting them from too cold a temperature, whereas in the pot, they are going to be exposed to the elements more readily. So you're going to want to do a number of things. water those plants well in the fall until the plants are dormant. Then if you at all can, move them into a sheltered environment, a garage or some inner area. Add mulch to the top. Pack the containers in either cardboard boxes that are surrounded by compost, or as shown in this picture, you could take a lightweight fence, wrap it around the pot, and put straw or leaves or other compost, again, to protect it. And finally, in this spring, you're going to cut back the dry back, and hopefully you'll have a plant that you can enjoy during the next season. I hope we've talked about a lot of the questions that you might have and what you might want to do to have a very successful container gardening on your deck. If we haven't answered your questions, and we'll ask for questions after this, you can go to the University of Minnesota's Extension Yard and Garden website. And if you have very specific questions that you want asked, there's a Master Gardener line that you can leave a question on a recording, and a Master Gardener will get back to you within 24 to 48 hours to answer your specific question. Again, thank you for joining us, and I hope this will provide you with an opportunity to have a wonderful, successful garden on your deck during this upcoming summer.
So, Linda?
Yes.
Oh, Don had mentioned that when you are adding fertilizer, also check to see if the pot already had fertilizer in it.
Oh, the soil. Yeah, the soil often does have, and so certainly I'm hearing a feedback here, but the soil often comes with fertilizer, but after a period of time, you still will need to add additional fertilizer.
Okay.
I have a couple of questions.
Yes, Kathy.
One is just related to the, I'm kind of getting feedback on my voice. About the pests, what about squirrels and things like that? Do they ever bother plants?
Oh, yeah.
Container plants, and what can you do about that? And then I have another question too.
You know, those little pests, you know, when you talk about gardening in your garden, you talk about the deer or the squirrels or the rabbits, and usually there's not a great answer for that. Even, and the same holds true on your deck. I think the only thing you can do is try to protect them with either some wire fencing. You certainly can use chicken wire just as you would around your garden outside. And I'm not sure, maybe someone else has figured out something else to do. I haven't had a problem with squirrels getting at my plants on my deck, but I would assume that it's something that people have experienced.
And my other question is about when you're talking about heavy containers, could you put peat moss in the bottom?
Yeah, that would be another way. Again, putting any fillers like that would be a way of reducing the weight. Absolutely. And I didn't talk about, you may want to actually have a little trolley, a little wheeled, whatever surface that you put it on so you can move it back and forth. I know that a lot of people use that as an option. Great suggestion. That's a wonderful suggestion.
Someone suggested to me once that a good filler for pots, it's a good use for all those packing peanuts that you're getting in all of your shipments right now, but just be sure to put some kind of like landscape fabric or something over the top, because otherwise they have a tendency to drift upwards and you find them on the top of your soil.
Interesting. Yeah. So in other words, putting those down at the bottom, putting some of that fabric over it, and then the soil on top of that.
Yeah.
Right.
I haven't tried that. It sounds like a great idea.
Great suggestion. Any other things that people have done to address that problem? I always learn things when I'm doing these, so I love it. Any other questions?
I'm just going to say, ill plants, their leaves tend to look, if not yellow, sometimes it's just a bad look of green. They're not shiny and perky. That's another way to say look for pests.
Ah, yes. Anything else?
Well, one thing that I learned the hard way a number of years ago is that the higher up in, say, in an apartment building that your deck is, the less likely you are to be visited by pollinators. So that if you're growing a vegetable that requires a bee to come along and pollinate it, and you're up on the 9th floor, and you're wondering why you're not getting any peppers or cucumbers, that could be why.
Very interesting. That makes a lot of sense, and it's something I hadn't thought about. I thought about, and I didn't talk about the impact of wind and other things on the higher level, but that's another challenge, is the lack of pollinators.
Do you have any suggestions for, I know why I am talking twice is because I tried to get on with my iPhone at first. So anyhow, do you have any suggestions for combinations of flowers and vegetables that would be kind of pretty? Oh.
Yeah, no, I think the most important thing is to think about the flowers that have the same requirements for watering and sun that your vegetables do. You know, I've heard, I had an example of an attempt I made where I just didn't follow that rule, and you know, I wasn't getting the vegetables weren't getting adequate watering because of what the plant required. So I think that's the major issue to consider. Anything else? The other thing to look at is if you look online, there are companion plants that they're referred to. For example, they talk about basil and oregano. It's an herb, but that is a wonderful companion plant for tomatoes or peppers. So it provides you with an opportunity to have tomatoes, but use that space around it to provide you with some other sort item that you might really like to have in your garden. Anything else? Looks like we may be done. Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Thank you, Linda, very much.
Sorry I was late.
It's always nice to see you, Kathy.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop recording now. And if I need to edit some of the speaking at the end out, I will, but we can answer those questions as well.
Great. Let me know if you need anything else.
Oh, Linda, somebody asked, do you always use fresh soil every year?
I don't. I just saw a comment about that a good suggestion is to put compost in it in the fall on the top, so it absorbs into the soil over the winter. The only caveat is, of course, if you've had some kind of a disease in your plants during one season, you don't want to continue that during the next. So you might, if you've had some real problems, get rid of the soil.
I can use the soil, then you either have to add fertilizer or I don't know.
I'm sorry, could you say it again?
You'd have to add fertilizer. It'd also be a little more compacted. I mean, you're taking a little risk by using it twice, but you know, I guess you just weigh it out and decide.
Well, Linda, this was very interesting. I think you did a great job.
Well, thank you. I always, like I said, learn things, and hopefully this again addressed what people need. I would appreciate if we have feedback on these and hear what feedback we get. I hope that's going to be part of it this year.
Yeah, Robert was talking about working out a sheet for that. Yes.
Good.
A little survey, you know, that helps the presenter and helps us to know maybe we should do this for the next time, you know.
Yeah.
Because your speaking is very clear and you go over a lot of information.
Yeah.
You know, everybody's going to like this, I'm sure.
It's nice and clean.
It was great, Linda.
Oh.
Did you do all the little, you have the photos come in one after the other so that you focus on one thing at a time? That's a step above what I know what to do with PowerPoint. That's nice.
It's actually not hard. I can show you that.
Yeah.
It's very easy. It's called animation, I think, if you look at it on a PowerPoint.
Yeah, I really think that made it more interesting.
Yes.
I mean, it was interesting anyway, but it was fun seeing some cartoons and some, you know, photos and all mixed up.
It was a good, great.
Mixed up is the word, huh?
And the right amount of words, not too much, you know.
And slowly, and you spoke slowly. So I think that's important for other people to remember.
Yes.
I'm glad you said that because in some case I felt like I was just kind of rushing. So thank you.
It's good. This is our first one. Yay.
Well, good. If you want an audience for some of the others, I'd certainly be